I am your host, James Morgan, and this is History of Cities. Episode 9, The End of Greece. We last left off with the Second Macedonian War and the Roman Seleucid War, in which the Romans defeated their two strongest rivals in the east. As we will see in this episode, the Greek people tried vainly to hold off the encroaching Western power, but were ultimately unsuccessful. In the end, it was the disunity of the Hellenic world that allowed the Romans to systematically carve up and eat them in bite-sized chunks. With the subjugation of the Greek people, Byzantium will enter a new era as its fate will once again be decided by forces largely outside of its control. But for now, let's see how the Greeks lost their independence, starting with the Third Macedonian War. The implacable king of Macedonia that has been the primary character in the last two episodes was perhaps one of the kingdom's most ambitious and talented leaders, which is really saying a lot when your predecessors include Alexander the Great and Philip II. Unfortunately, Philip V's ambition outweighed his ability to achieve it, and though he had fought valiantly over the course of the last three wars, his realm had shrunk rather than grown. The First Macedonian War had been a victory for Philip on paper, as he gained territory in Illyria and managed to stand his ground against a massive Roman-led coalition. However, he failed to achieve his goal of invading the Roman homeland to help the Carthaginians dismantle the Roman Republic, and so his victory was hollow. In the Second Macedonian War, Philip again faced a massive coalition of Greek states who were supported by Rome, and this time he could not withstand the onslaught. The resulting treaty stripped Philip of land in Thrace and Anatolia, severely limited the size of his army and navy, and forced him to pay heavy war reparations. During the Roman Seleucid War, Macedonia participated but only in a peripheral role. They did not formally join the Roman alliance, but they saw the chaos of war as an opportunity to snatch back some land in Greece, so they invaded the Seleucids' Greek ally, the Aetolian League. Philip was able to capture a few towns in Thessaly, but in the grand scheme of things this was a negligible gain. After the Seleucids were defeated by Rome, there was no major Greek kingdom that could challenge Roman influence in the region. This allowed for a period of relative peace for the next 17 years. Looking around, Philip despaired at the state of his realm. All his grand ambitions had turned to ash, and the once great Macedonian kingdom was left little more than a petulant child, to be disciplined by its overbearing Roman parent. As the king's age progressed, his health gradually declined, and the question of succession was broached with ever more urgency. The two contenders for the throne were Philip's eldest son Perseus, and his younger but more legitimate son Demetrius. The two men were split on the question of Rome. Perseus took after his father and was a staunch anti-Roman, while Demetrius saw the Romans as a chance to jump the line of succession and take the Macedonian throne. This caused Demetrius to scheme against his father's plans to solidify Macedon's position in the Greek peninsula. Eventually, things came to a head, and Philip was forced to make a decision. He was torn between his duty to his kingdom and the love he felt for both of his sons. Ultimately, Philip made the choice to execute Demetrius for treason. The death of his son at his own hands was a fatal blow to Philip, and he died a year later in 179 BC. Perseus ascended the throne in that same year. Perseus was very much cut from the same cloth as his father. He harbored deep resentment against the Romans for their role in Macedonia's fall from grace. The young king was driven by ambition, but he was not reckless. He knew that he stood no chance of victory if he faced the Romans alone. To strengthen his position, Perseus would need allies, so he married the daughter of Seleucus IV. Seleucus had succeeded Antiochus the Great as ruler of the Seleucid Empire in 187 BC, and the marriage between his daughter and Perseus seemed to be the prelude to a strong anti-Roman alliance. However, before the two kingdoms could unite against Rome, Seleucus was assassinated, and the Seleucid Empire fell into his uncle, Antiochus IV's hands. Antiochus was much more interested in cultivating a mutually beneficial relationship with Rome, and so Perseus's great ally slipped from his grasp. Undeterred, Perseus sent word to almost every independent Greek city and state. His call for a massive Greek alliance, the likes of which had not been seen since the days of the Greco-Persian Wars, found eager listeners among the Greek people who still held Hellenic patriotism dear. A coalition began to form which included parties that did not cherish the thought of Roman overlords, or those that longed to see the days of united Greek glory under Alexander the Great return, or those who were just unhappy with the political status quo and wanted a revolution. Whatever their motivation, large numbers of Greeks flocked to Perseus's banner. They were opposed by those Greeks who were not charmed by Perseus's overtures. This so-called pro-Roman faction consisted of states that saw Macedonia as a more tyrannical ruler than Rome, or those that saw Perseus's naked ambition as a threat to their independence, or those that actually liked the Romans and viewed them as brothers or benevolent rulers. The Roman Senate was not blind to this growing unrest to their east, and after almost 2 decades of peace with the Greek people, they believed this issue could be solved diplomatically before it exploded into another Greco-Roman war. In the early days of 173 BC, Roman agents reached out to Macedonia and their principal allies in the Aetolian League. These agents were refused an audience with Perseus. Having hit a dead end on the diplomatic front, the Senate was driven to the opinion that Macedonia was hell-bent on a war with Rome and her allies. Despite this prevailing sense of inevitable conflict, the Romans did not want to be the aggressors, so they waited for Perseus to make his move, while simultaneously shoring up their alliance network in Greece in case their fears were realized. Perseus's greatest rival in the east was the kingdom of Pergamon, ruled by Eumenes II. Pergamon had been the most consistent ally of Rome during the first 2 Macedonian wars and the Roman Seleucid War. This relationship with the powerful Western Republic greatly expanded Pergamon's territory and strength. While the Macedonians began preparing for war by collecting food for soldiers and acquiring mercenaries in the thousands, Eumenes II made a trip to the Roman Senate. He was both worried about Perseus's rising power and eager to profit off another Roman victory in Greece. To fan the flames of war in the Senate, Eumenes made an impassioned speech, pleading for the Romans to uphold their promise of protecting the status quo in Greece by putting down the Macedonian rabble. While Eumenes was right that Perseus had been planning for a large-scale war, he did embellish his tale with the absurd claim that the Macedonian armies would not be attacking Greek states, but instead planned to invade Italy. Coincidentally, diplomats sent by Perseus arrived in Rome just a few days after Eumenes had made his speech. They attempted to correct the narrative and told the Senate that Perseus harbored no ill will against Rome. It was all for naught, as the Romans had already been swayed by Eumenes and had refused to believe anything that the Macedonians said. Upon returning to Macedonia, the diplomats informed Perseus that the Romans were immovable in their conviction to oppose him. Perseus was not surprised by this news, but he was enraged at the gall of Eumenes to drip poisonous lies into the ears of the Senate, and he began plotting with his mercenaries to assassinate the king of Pergamon. The plan was to kill Eumenes when he came to visit Delphi, as he would have been far away from Pergamon, and thus the response to his death would have been delayed. However, the assassins failed and the co-conspirators were captured, to be brought before the Roman Senate. These captives claimed that the plot also included the attempted poisoning of prominent Roman citizens. This further enraged the already war-hungry Senate, and they voted to raise an army immediately to set sail for Apollonia. Before they could set sail, one final attempt at a diplomatic solution was made. Perseus told Roman observers in Greece that he did not desire war with Rome and secured an agreement with them to send envoys to the Senate to try and persuade them to cancel the invasion. Unfortunately for Perseus, the pro-war faction in the Senate was intractable, and the invasion would go forward. War was now upon Greece once again. The Roman coalition met in Apollonia in 171 BC. Their forces consisted of around 12,000 Roman legionaries and 16,000 infantry from a myriad of Greek allies. Unlike with previous Greco-Roman wars, this one was much more divisive within previously unified territories. Many cities within alliances such as the Aetolian and Boeotian leagues were split on whether to side with Perseus or the Romans. These divisions pitted those who believed Roman cooperation or integration was the logical and inevitable future for Greece against those who desired to either maintain Greek independence or return to the days of a united Hellenic Empire. This discord caused a few long-standing leagues to be dissolved, and before a single battle had even been fought, the political landscape of Greece had been dramatically reordered. As the Romans congregated in Apollonia, Perseus moved his army of around 43,000 allied Greeks into Thessaly. Neither side was looking for a major engagement during the first few months of the war, and they carefully danced around each other, capturing towns and raiding the countryside. Finally, Perseus decided it was time to force the Romans to meet him in a large-scale battle, and he sent groups of his men into southern Thessaly to try and draw out the main Roman army into the range of his forces. The Romans ignored this obvious bait, and Perseus was forced to take a more direct approach. He sent a scouting party to probe the Roman camp in Thessaly, and a small, indecisive skirmish took place. Confident now of both the position and strength of the opposing army, Perseus marched his men to a field near a hill called Callinicus, and lined them up in a battle formation. He was within sight of the Roman camp, and he hoped that the enemy cavalry would be baited into attacking his exposed infantry line, where they would then be slaughtered by Perseus's hidden cavalry. The Macedonians attempted this trap over and over again, each day arriving at the same time and lining up in front of the Romans. Finally, after a few days with no response from the Romans, Perseus got impatient and decided that the next day he would arrive at the battlefield early and attack immediately. What followed was the first major battle of the Third Macedonian War, called the Battle of Callinicus after the nearby hill. The main historical source for this battle, the Roman historian named Titus Livius, or more commonly, Livy, describes the troop engagements and events of the battle in great detail. Seeing as he wouldn't even be born for another 120 years after the Battle of Callinicus, we can assume that he was either drawing from an unnamed first-hand source, or he used the favorite source of ancient historians, just making stuff up. Either way, it is safe to say that the Macedonian and Roman armies were of roughly equal size. Despite this equal footing, Perseus was able to take advantage of his offensive position to attack the Greek troops in the center of the Roman column. These Greeks were not as disciplined as the Roman legionaries, and likely were less committed to fighting other Greeks, and they quickly broke and ran. This disintegration of the center led to a general retreat by the entire Roman army, while their allies from Thessaly covered them. Perseus pursued with caution, and when the Roman reinforcements started arriving from their camp, he took the advice of his subordinates and decided to let the Romans go. Because he was unable to completely destroy the Roman army, this battle is considered an inconclusive victory for Perseus. Still, he had only lost around 60 men, while he had inflicted over 2,000 casualties. The Roman commanders quickly moved their camp to a more secure position, and then went about doling out blame for the humiliating, yet not crippling, loss. They pinned most of this blame on their Greek allies, who had broken rank and caused a mass panic along the line. They did, however, reserve some praise for the Thessalians, who had covered their retreat and prevented the battle from becoming a total disaster. All in all, the battle did very little to change the course of the war. The two sides settled back into their little dance around Greece, as they alternated capturing cities and probed each other with relatively small skirmishes. Finally, the campaign months of 171 BC drew to a close, and both armies settled down into winter quarters. As the new year rolled around, it was time to switch out the Roman consuls and turn the persecution of the war over into new hands. This was initially a welcome development, as the previous commanders had become frustrated at their lack of glory and took it out on the Greeks, both their allies and enemies. But it didn't take long for the new consuls to pick up where their predecessors had left off. The year of 170 BC proved to be a disaster for the Romans. Repeated defeats in the field, combined with growing resentment and fear among the Greeks, caused the Senate to become concerned about the potential outcome of this war. In order to obtain a clearer picture, they sent representatives to Greece on a fact-finding mission. These men reported back that the situation was indeed grim, and changes in strategy would have to be made if Rome wanted to turn things around. With the new consuls in 169 BC, the Romans sent fresh troops and recalled some of the superfluous soldiers. The war effort was reinvigorated, but the trend of capturing towns and looting the country while avoiding large-scale engagements continued. The casualty numbers increased at a steady trickle throughout the year, but the nearly endless resources of Rome meant that they could absorb these losses indefinitely, while it seemed to Perseus that his energy was slowly draining. Therefore, at the end of 169, Perseus sent envoys to the Senate to propose a peace. These envoys included mediators from the kingdom of Bithynia and representatives of the island of Rhodes. The Rhodians were reluctant allies of Rome, and they supported Perseus's peace proposal because the war had stifled trade in the Mediterranean. Peace terms proved unachievable, and when the Rhodians commented that if the Romans did not end the war, then they would have to reconsider which side they fought for. This veiled threat drove the Senate even further from the possibility of peace, and they vowed that once they had defeated Macedonia, they would have to decide what punishment Rhodes deserved for their insolence. The next year would prove to be the final act of the Third Macedonian War, and it was impossible to tell going into it which way the chips would fall. Once again, the Romans sent fresh troops with their new consuls. A new strategy was devised for a two-front assault. One army would advance toward Macedonia, while another would wage a campaign in Illyria. As these plans were being made, Perseus pursued a diplomatic campaign to gain new allies and perhaps force the Romans into a position where peace negotiations were more enticing than further conflict. Perseus had guessed rightly that though Rome had the resources to continue fighting in Greece, they were reluctant to throw away more money and men than what they viewed Greece was worth. At the current moment, it was within reason that the present forces they had in the east would be enough to subdue Perseus and his allies. But if the Macedonians procured a few key alliances, the position would become untenable, and the Romans would be forced to choose between suing for peace or being dragged into an expensive quagmire. Perseus had his eyes on which parties were teetering on the issue of whether or not to join him, as well as those that had significant enough power to shift the balance in his favor. These parties were the Illyrian king Gentius, the Rhodians, the Gallic tribes, Antiochus IV, ruler of the Seleucid Empire, and, surprisingly, the steadfast Roman ally Eumenes II, king of Pergamon. Now Perseus knew that it was unlikely that Eumenes would turn his back on Rome, but he hoped that he could bribe the king into being a mediator for favorable peace talks with the Romans. In addition, he conducted this potential bribery in a manner that made it look like he was conspiring with Pergamon behind the Romans' back, which damaged the relationship between the two allies. If Perseus could not get Eumenes to mediate for him, he at least sought to drive a wedge far enough between his two enemies that they might turn on each other. To Perseus's delight, Eumenes responded positively to his backroom dealings and agreed to withdraw his army and navy from the coalition for the lowly sum of 1,000 talents. Additionally, he agreed to be Perseus's unbiased mediator for an added sum of 15,000 talents. It is at this point that Perseus's fatal flaw came into play. This flaw was that he was a notorious miser. He was greedy and stingy. When it came to money, he was quick to make promises, but very rarely followed through. So of course, when Eumenes asked for an advance in order to become Perseus's buddy, Perseus ghosted him and lost his best chance to end the war swiftly. This diplomatic debacle was no unique story, as in turn, Perseus's dubious money practices cost him all of his potential allies. First, Gentius requested 300 talents as payment for attacking the Romans in his land. Perseus sent the money with his men, but told them not to give the king the money until after he had provoked the Romans. After Gentius imprisoned 2 Roman envoys, irreversibly placing himself in the pro-Macedonian faction, Perseus ordered his men to turn around and bring the money back. Likewise, when he tried to hire Gallic mercenaries, he was non-committal in his offer to only hire a small portion of their force. In return, he got nothing, and the Gauls burned a path through Thrace as they left in disgust. Through these actions, Perseus had turned a sure diplomatic victory into an unpredictable final confrontation on the battlefield. This confrontation would come alongside a river near the city of Pydna in central Macedonia. Not since the first year of the war had the main bodies of each army maneuvered so close to each other. Both Perseus and the Roman consul Aemilius chose to make camp near terrain that they thought would benefit their tactics. The Macedonians camped on an even plain that would make their static phalanx more effective and allow their cavalry to make easy charges. Conversely, the Romans chose an uneven patch of land somewhat nearby that offered favorable conditions if they were attacked, and was close enough that they could keep an eye on the Macedonians. Funnily enough, because the camps were so close together, they used the same river as a water source. Each morning, the two armies would send out pack animals and a small group of soldiers to collect water. The two sides would eye each other up as they loaded up their water skins, and the tension was palpable. One day, while filling up their water skins, one of the Roman mules broke loose from its owner and bolted towards the Macedonians. Now historians debate whether this was an accident or planned by Aemilius as a way to provoke the Macedonians into a trap, but whatever the cause, it was the thing to break the tension. The two water-carrying contingents were quickly embroiled in a deadly skirmish, and each army immediately mobilized to aid them. The Macedonians were faster to form up and began marching into battle, which actually turned out to be to their disadvantage. This meant that by the time they met the main body of the Romans, they were far from their camp and began encountering the rough terrain near the Roman camp. As the ground became more and more uneven, gaps began forming in the formerly solid phalanx. It was at this point that the outcome of the battle became inevitable, as the legions threw themselves into these gaps and tore apart the Macedonian lines. The utter scale of this disaster is hard to imagine. Out of the 43,000 men that Perseus had camped near Pydna, half of them were dead. A further 11,000 of them were taken prisoner. With his army completely destroyed and the Romans at the doorstep to his capital, Perseus began a lengthy flight, just barely staying ahead of his enemies. First he ran to Pella, and then to Amphipolis, but he was not warmly welcomed by the citizens in his own capital, so he moved on to Gillespus. All the while, Perseus was sending representatives to the Romans, begging for peace terms, but at this point he had no way of hoping for anything other than unconditional surrender. From Gillespus he sailed to the sacred island of Samothrace. This sealed his fate and ended his flight, as the unopposed Roman navy surrounded the island and patiently waited for Perseus to slip up. In a twist of fate so fitting that it is almost unbelievable, as Perseus attempted to pay his way to escape, his ship left as soon as the money was on board, but without him. Perseus's dishonesty with money had gotten him into this mess, and now it was his turn to be swindled. It almost feels like the historians made this one up to add a moral to this story about the virtue of honest dealings. With no more money and nowhere to run, Perseus voluntarily gave himself up to the commander of the Roman navy. Thus ended the Third Macedonian War, and the line of kings that had ruled Macedonia since the death of Alexander the Great. While the contemporary narrative of the war that I have drawn from might make it seem that most of the burden of defeat lays with Perseus and his implacable greed, that puts a bit too much responsibility in the hands of one great man. In reality, it was the division of the Greek people that eventually led to their downfall. We have seen that in times when a majority of the powerful Greek rivals put aside their differences, like in the Greco-Persian Wars or under Alexander the Great, they are able to overcome enormous obstacles. Unfortunately for Perseus and the Macedonians, Greek unity was a distant memory by the time Rome came knocking. As the Macedonians had surrendered unconditionally, and there was no one left in Greece who could even attempt to oppose the Romans, the Senate was given a free hand to remake the East in any way they pleased. Wanting to appear magnanimous and honorable, the men of the Senate elected that they would not directly annex any territory, as they said that, quote, Rome did not carry slavery to the free, end quote. Instead, they partitioned Macedonia and Illyria into tributary republics that they administered over. This was basically an inch short of direct annexation into the Roman Republic, and the Greek cities were now subjects of Rome in all but name. Despite the Senate's claim that they did not carry slavery to the free, when the last bastion of Greek rebellion in the province of Epirus was finally subdued, the Romans burned 70 of their cities and enslaved a whopping 150,000 people. Now, from the Senate's point of view, they had acted rationally and fairly against an aggressor that had provoked them 3 times in the last 40 years. They believed the matter in Greece was a closed case, and no more trouble was forthcoming. From the Macedonians' point of view, the situation was an unbearable shame. Beyond the fact that they had been utterly destroyed on the battlefield, the most humiliating part of the post-war agreement was that they had lost their king and had been partitioned into 4 republics. The Macedonian citizens were not avid Republicans. In fact, they mostly despised the democratic nature of their Greek brothers. The kingdom of Macedonia had been ruled by a single strong monarch for as long as the city of Rome had existed. Even after the founding dynasty ended with Alexander the Great's death in 323 BC, they had persisted with a new line of kings for another 150 years. This intense pro-monarchy tradition created an atmosphere in the new republics that favored any strong man who could claim the title of king of the Macedonians. Still, the Romans had gone to great lengths to limit the possibility of a resurgent united kingdom. They forbade the Macedonians from mining silver or gold to limit their economy. They allowed them to field armies that were only large enough to secure their borders against raiding tribes, and they took the old ruling elites back to Rome as hostages to destroy the old social order. These draconian measures worked in weakening the Macedonians, but also added to their resentment of the Romans and their republican governments. 15 years after the end of the Third Macedonian War, this discontented population would find a potential new king in a Greek man by the name of Andriscus. This man, who claimed to be Philip, the son of Perseus, marched into Macedonia in 153 BC and laid claim to the throne. He was immediately thrown out by the combined armies of three of the republics. Not one to give up easily, Andriscus made his way to Syria, to the court of Demetrius I, who was the latest in a revolving door of Seleucid rulers. He implored the Seleucid monarch to aid him in reclaiming the Macedonian throne, but Demetrius was unmoved and had Andriscus arrested and sent to Rome. The Senate was rather nonchalant about this pretender, and did not execute him or even imprison him in a very secure location. Instead, Andriscus was able to escape his captivity and fled to Anatolia, which didn't seem to bother the Senate in the slightest. Once in Miletus, Andriscus again began campaigning for support for his reconquest of Macedonia, but again he was arrested and handed over to the Roman envoys. Just like the Senate, these envoys did not take him seriously and simply let him go. This time, Andriscus was able to procure support from Macedonian exiles in Pergamon and Byzantium. With this springboard, he was able to also procure an alliance with the Odrysian king Teres III. Teres vouched for Andriscus among the other leaders in Thrace, and his numbers began to swell significantly. Finally, 4 years after his first attempt in 153 BC, Andriscus re-entered Macedonia. At first he was unsuccessful and forced to regroup outside of Macedonian territory, but he quickly returned and was able to defeat one of the Republican armies in battle and reconquered the old royal capital of Pella. After reclaiming the ancient throne, Andriscus began calling himself Philip to portray himself as the direct successor of the Antigonid dynasty, but we will continue to refer to him as Andriscus. Now that he had a foothold in eastern Macedonia, Andriscus was able to subdue the remaining puppet republics and make plans for further conquests outside of historical Macedonian territory. His first target was Thessaly, that had previously been under Macedonian rule since it was conquered by Philip II, until it was released after the Second Macedonian War. This aggressive action eventually got the attention of the Roman Senate, though they were not hasty in their actions and instead sent a representative to figure out how grave this threat really was. The representative initially tried to end the conflict diplomatically, but as he would not capitulate to Andriscus's ridiculous demands, he was forced to send word back to Rome, asking for military aid. The Senate and the commander they assigned to the task of putting down this rebellion in the east were still not overly concerned. They underestimated Andriscus and the size of his army, and when the legion tried to invade Macedonia, they were caught by surprise and obliterated. Never before in the 40-year history of the Macedonian Wars had a Roman legion been so thoroughly defeated by a Greek army. The battle sent shockwaves through the Hellenic and Roman world, and jolted the Senate into more serious action. The humiliation in Greece, compounded with the ongoing crisis in Africa called the Third Punic War, put the Romans in a mood of extreme retribution. Their previous policy of hands-off subjugation and relative leniency gave way to the more stereotypical brutal Roman conquest. To ensure that there would not be another disaster in Greece, this time the Senate sent 2 legions under a new proconsular commander. Additionally, the Romans received assistance from their steadfast ally Pergamon, and together they steadily advanced into Macedonia. Andriscus decided to make his stand where his supposed father had last fought the Romans. The Second Battle of Pydna is less precisely documented than the first, but its outcome was very much the same, as the Macedonian army was routed and scattered, effectively ending the fourth and final Macedonian War. This time, the punishment for the Macedonians and their allies the Byzantines would be much more harsh. The benevolent Roman sentiment was gone, destroyed by uprisings in the lands they had previously been content on letting be autonomous tributaries. In Africa, after the Third Punic War, Carthage was burned to the ground and the earth was salted. The former Carthaginian lands were directly annexed by Rome. Likewise, in Greece, after the Fourth Macedonian War, the previous 4 puppet republics were thrown out, and the kingdom was directly annexed, becoming the Roman province of Provincia Macedonia. This province would eventually grow to encompass all of mainland Greece. We will stop this episode with the end of the Macedonian Wars, but next episode we will blitz through as many years of history as we have covered in the last 9. During the late Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, Byzantium will remain a peripheral footnote, so there isn't really much to dwell on. Instead, I will try to touch on all the major events that happened in the empire that lead us to the great hinge point of our story.
As always, if you have any questions or think I missed anything,
please feel free to email me at hofcpod.cast@gmail.com or DM me on Twitter at HOFC_podcast. Thank you for listening to this episode, and please join me next time for the history of Byzantium.